צהריים טובים. אני רוצה להודות למחלקה למחשבת ישראל, ובמיוחד לפרופסור דניאל לסקר, על ההזמנה להשתתף בסמינר הזה. ואני מצטער על זה שהחלטתי להגיש את הרצאתי באנגלית ולא בעברית. עדיף לי להיות מדויק בדבריי מלחפש מילים הכי מתאימות בשפה אחרת. אשמח בסופו של דבר לקבל שאלות בעברית, וגם אנסה להגיב בעברית כמיטב יכולתי. The Geonim and the Rishonim lived in societies whose culture was shaped by Islam or Christianity, and they interacted with Muslims and Christians on a daily basis. These facts, however, are hardly apparent when one examines the Halakhic literature produced by these medieval figures. References to non-Jews are pervasive in the responsa literature, as well as in codes and related texts, but it's only on rare occasions that Halakhic texts address Christians or Muslims as such. My remarks this afternoon will seek to explain this phenomenon and to account for the conceptions of Christians and Muslims found in the few texts that do focus specifically on adherents of the dominant religious traditions. My research into conceptions of Christians and Muslims within Halakhic literature began with a study regarding food prepared by or shared with members of other religions. Regulations governing such issues as bread baked by Gentiles, wine touched by Gentiles, sharing meals with Gentiles, and so on. This study, published in Foreigners and Their Food and various supplemental articles, examines not only Jewish legal sources, but also Christian and Islamic law from antiquity and the Middle Ages. I'm now in the initial stages of preparing a broader study on conceptions of self and other within the medieval legal literature of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This research is currently taking place within the framework of a project entitled Relmin, the legal status of religious minorities in the Euro-Mediterranean world, 5th through 15th centuries. Relmin, directed by John Tolan of the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme Ange Dupont of Nantes, is funded by a grant from the European Research Council, and the project seeks to create a database of all medieval laws that address adherents of a foreign religion, complete with texts, translations, commentaries, and bibliographies. I'm among the team members responsible for texts by Rishonim regarding non-Jews. My remarks this afternoon will be based both on published findings and on this research in progress. It's fitting to present this new research for the first time here at Universitat Ben-Gurion, as Professor Lasker has recently been asking some of the same questions that I pose in my own scholarship. In what ways are Jewish portrayals of non-Jews different in Christian Europe than in the Islamic world? What accounts for these differences? Professor Lasker approaches this subject primarily through the lens of polemical literature, whereas my focus is on legal literature. The difference between these literary genres, we'll see, is quite significant. To understand conceptions of Christians and Muslims within medieval Halakhic literature, it's crucial to understand how Talmudic sources portray Gentiles. It's also helpful to understand the conceptions of religious foreigners expressed in the legal literature of medieval Christianity and Islam. These non-Jewish sources illustrate alternative approaches to thinking about members of other religions, as well as to thinking about communal self-identity. These are approaches that may have been familiar to at least some, maybe even most, Geonim and Rishonim. I'll begin then with remarks on each of these topics before turning to the Halakhic literature at the core of my current research. I should say up front that my remarks about conceptions of Gentiles in the Talmud may seem obvious, but I believe that reflection on these familiar ideas is worthwhile. Chazal divide the world into two categories, Yisrael va'amim, us and them. In doing so, they embrace a binary division of humanity already apparent in Jewish literature from the Second Temple period, a division that in turn parallels the Hellenistic practice of defining people as either Greeks or barbarians. just as the Hellenistic system for classifying humanity glosses over the differences among various types of non-Greeks, Chazal ignore distinctions among various types of non-Jews. They're all simply Goyim. I use the Yiddish inflection of that word intentionally. It captures the dismissive and derogatory nature of rabbinic attitudes toward Gentiles. All Goyim are alike for the purposes of Talmudic halakha. The differences among them are legally irrelevant. The most important fact about Goyim is that, by definition, they lack the primary characteristics that mark Jews as Jews. In the binary system employed by Chazal, Jews are 1, while Gentiles are 0, an absence of significance. Gentiles function within Halakhic literature like the blank space on a page that enables us to better see the ink, namely the mitzvot incumbent upon Jews. So, for example, discussions of Hilchot Shabbat address the question, in what ways may individuals who are obligated to observe Shabbat, namely Jews, benefit from the actions of those who aren't obligated to observe Shabbat, namely Goyim? Similarly, many of the laws governing food associated with Gentiles focus on the fact that Gentiles don't keep kosher. What matters about Gentiles in these laws is simply the fact that they are not Jews. Hilchot Avodah Zarah are different in that they ascribe beliefs and behaviors to Gentiles themselves. Here too, however, Chazal draw no distinctions between different types of Gentiles, and define Goyim as the antithesis of good Jews. All Gentiles are idolaters, and they all engage in the same types of idolatrous behaviors. On the basis of rabbinic literature, one could easily conclude that Asherah was still worshipped in the Greco-Roman world, and that Babylonians worshipped Mercules. Chazal, after all, discuss theoretical and actual practices of idolatry in the same manner. Hilchot Yenesech presume that all Gentiles offer idolatrous wine libations at every available opportunity, and indeed that they do so in a manner that directly parallels the libations offered by the Kohanim in the Jerusalem temple. How exactly the Goyim know all of this, I don't know. But the bottom line is that Chazal never addressed the fact that by the time the Talmudim were compiled, most of the Gentiles living alongside Jews were not pagans, but rather Christians or Zoroastrians, neither of whose traditions involve the offering of wine libations by the laity. Through the act of defining Gentiles as generic idolaters, Chazal expressed the notion that the people of Israel constitutes a uniquely holy and uniquely significant nation. Now, you might think that this approach to classifying humanity is commonplace. Of course, people divide the world into us and them and regard themselves as special. This is true, but Christian and Islamic authorities developed more complex ways of classifying foreigners in the Middle Ages. These added complexities reflect the distinct ways in which medieval Christians and Muslims viewed both themselves and those who follow different religions. Early medieval Christian authorities divide humanity not simply into Christians and non-Christians, but rather into 3 categories: Christians, pagans, and Jews. Each of these categories is assigned its own legal status within canon law, the religious law of the Church. Rather than grouping all non-Christians together, early medieval canon law regularly distinguishes Jews from pagans, assigning to Jews a uniquely inferior status. So, for example, marriages between Christians and Jews are subject to more severe penalties than marriages between Christians and pagans. Canons about slavery focus particular attention on the dangers posed to Christian slaves by Jewish masters. Matzah is defined as being even more abhorrent than food offered to idols. Canons also portray Jews as especially malicious toward Christians, and Jewish converts as especially prone to revert to their prior faith. The conception of Jews that emerges from these laws is that of a demonic opposite of pious Christians, in contrast to the neutral portrayal of the average pagan. If Christians are assigned the value 1, Jews are -1, while other non-Christians are merely 0. This definition of Jews as anti-Christians constitutes one element in a broader theological effort to define Christianity itself as the sole heir to Israel's holiness. We have to prove that we are the descendants of Israel, and therefore we prove that the Jews have completely gone off the spectrum. Beginning in the late 12th century, however, the distinctive legal status ascribed to Jews becomes attenuated, as jurists increasingly apply Jewry law to subject Muslim populations as well. This shift coincides with the crystallization of the theological doctrine extra ecclesia nulla salus. Outside the church, there is no salvation, which lays out a binary classification of humanity similar to the Greek barbarian or Jew-Gentile dichotomy. At the moment, I remain uncertain about the degree to which this development in Christian theology accounts for the shifting legal status of non-Christians in the late Middle Ages. Islamic law displays a different approach to classifying humanity. Most laws governing dhimmis treat all non-Muslims alike as inferiors within Islamic society. Some Sunni laws, however, ascribe to Jews and Christians an elevated position relative to other non-Muslims. Thus, Muslims may eat meat prepared by Jewish and Christian butchers, but not Zoroastrian or pagan butchers. And Muslim men may marry Jewish and Christian women, but not Zoroastrians or pagans. Laws about the blood money owed to victims of accidental homicide define in quantitative terms the relative status of different types of non-Muslims. Jews and Christians are worth 1/2 or 1/3 the value of a Muslim, while Zoroastrians are worth only 1/15 the value of a Muslim. These laws make manifest the difference between the hierarchical system of classifying humanity found within Sunni Islam and the nuance-free dichotomy of Jews and Gentiles evident within Talmudic literature. The Sunni practice of elevating people of the book over other non-Muslims serves to highlight the similarity between Islam and its scriptural predecessors, while bolstering the authority of the Quran as the latest and most perfect revelation of God's will. The Quran, after all, itself ascribes significance to the Torah, the Gospels, and those who adhere to these books. By emphasizing the ways in which Jews and Christians are like Muslims, Sunnis also, in effect, enlarge the community of consensus with respect to certain core principles of Islam. Recall that the notion of consensus, ijma, rests at the core of Sunni self-definition. Not only does Islamic law assign a different legal status to members of different religions, it accords legal significance to specific elements of foreign religious traditions. For example, many Sunni jurists distinguish between Christian butchers who invoke the name of God when slaughtering an animal, and those who invoke the name of Christ, permitting the former act of slaughter, but not the latter. Some of these jurists, familiar with rabbinite Jewish practices, also distinguish between kosher and treifa meat. They prohibit Muslims from eating treifa animals slaughtered by Jewish butchers, even though such animals are halal when prepared by Muslim butchers. The particular beliefs and practices of religious foreigners have legal significance within Islam itself. In offering this cursory review of Talmudic, Christian, and Islamic laws regarding adherence of foreign religions, my goal has been to highlight 3 points that will aid us in understanding conceptions of Christians and Muslims within medieval Halakhic literature. The first point is that the Geonim and Rishonim are heirs to a tradition that draws no distinctions among non-Jews. For Chazal, Christians are not significant as Christians, but instead are merely goyim, which of course means that they're idolaters. The second point is that the approach to constructing otherness employed by Chazal in Halakhic writings is not inevitable. There are other ways to define us and them, and indeed, other approaches are attested in the dominant cultures of the Middle Ages. The third point is that approaches to constructing the otherness of religious foreigners sometimes evolve over time, as is the case in medieval canon law. Another instance of such evolution is apparent when one examines references to Gentiles in Halakhic texts from the Islamic world. The vast majority of references to Goyim in Gaonic literature and works by Rishonim from Muslim Spain and North Africa follow the pattern established by Chazal. Gentiles are significant solely because they and their laws are not Jewish. For that reason, for example, Gentiles are not subject to rabbinic courts and are not valid as witnesses in such courts. Jews, in turn, may only appeal to Gentile courts under limited circumstances. Jews may lend money at interest to Gentiles, but may not sell certain kinds of real estate to them. Issues involving the Goy Shel Shabbat and related laws also figure prominently in this literature. None of these laws reflect conceptions of Muslims or Christians as such. Amidst the hundreds of references to non-Jews in Halakhic literature from the Muslim world, there are a handful that do distinguish Muslims from Christians and other Gentiles. Much attention has been devoted to these passages in Maimonides' legal works, so we'll begin there as well. The Rambam famously declares in his letter to Ovadia Hager that Islam is not idolatrous. Elu hayishmaelim einan ovdei avodah zarah klal, uchvar nichorta mipiyam milibam, vehem miyachadim le'el yitaleh yichud karaui, yichud she'en bo dofi. Christian theology, in contrast, fails to conform to Maimonides' strict standards for non-anthropomorphic monotheism. This distinction has legal implications with respect to wine associated with Christians and Muslims, a subject to which we'll return in a moment. Maimonides also goes out of his way to argue that Muslims are unique among non-Jews as being subject to the mitzvah of milah, and thus, in certain respects, as being co-heirs of Avraham Avinu. Muslims and Christians alike, however, fall into the category of kofrim, who have no share in the world to come. Professor Lasker has observed that most of the Rambam's statements about Islam, both legal and polemical, have parallels in the works of Geonim and earlier Rishonim. What's distinctive is the manner in which the Rambam frames these statements. Indeed, Maimonides is not the first to distinguish Muslims from other Goyim for legal purposes, but his conception of Muslims is nevertheless an original one. This can be seen with particular clarity through a close reading of the Halakha in the Mishneh Torah regarding Muslim wine, the first text on your handout. Ger Toshav, v'hu shekibel alav sheva mitzvot kmo shebe'arnu, yeino asur b'shtiyah u'mutar b'hanaya. וכן כל גוי שאינו עובד עבודה זרה, כגון אלו הישמעאלים, יינן אסור בשתייה ומותר בהניה, וכן הורו כל הגאונים. אבל הנוצרים עובדי עבודה זרה הן, וסתם יינם אסור בהניה. Wine associated with Christians is subject to all of the Talmudic laws of Yein Nesech, including the prohibition against hana'ah. Wine associated with Muslims, in contrast, is regarded as if it's the wine of a ger toshav, which Jews may not drink, but which remains mutar lahana'ah. The Rambam states that the Geonim also allowed Jews to derive benefit from wine touched by Muslims, and indeed they did. The Gaonic rationale for this leniency, however, is not the same as the Rambam's at all. The Geonim focus on the fact that Muslims, supposedly unlike Christians and other Goyim, do not employ wine libations as part of their worship. The Geonim presume, however, that Islamic worship is in fact idolatrous. In the words of Rav Nachshon Gaon, the second text on your handout, Yishmaeli ha'idana oved avodah zarahu, ve'eno mekir shehu oved. Hilchach, af al pi she'eno menasech, oved avodah zarahu. Another Geonic responsum, the third on your handout, observes regarding Muslims, she'ein menaschin yayin la'avodah zarah shelahen, and for that reason alone, compares Muslims to a tinoch ben yomo, whose contact renders wine asur lishtiyah umutar lahana'ah. The Mishneh Torah, in contrast, focuses not on the ritual practices of Muslims, but rather on their beliefs. The legal bottom line is identical, but the way in which the Rambam gets there is quite different. The unprecedented analogy of Muslims and the Ger Toshav, who renounces idolatry, reflects the Rambam's conviction that Muslims are monotheists, a conviction that most Geonim did not share. Each in their own way, the Geonim and the Rambam depart from Talmudic precedent by exempting an entire class of Gentiles from the most severe laws governing Yein Nesech. Recall that Chazal pay no attention to the actual religious practices of their Gentile neighbors, most of whom did not, in fact, offer wine libations on a regular basis. The Geonim are the first to grant legal weight to information about a foreign religious tradition. I would suggest that the Geonim did so because their cultural environment was one in which religious differences are ascribed normative significance. Recall that Sunni authorities grant legal weight to foreign beliefs and practices, and establish distinctions between different groups of non-Muslims. In a culture dominated by Sunni ideas, the legal relevance of information about other religions can be taken for granted as easily as the relevance of information about a law's economic impact, data that also plays an important role in Geonic responsa. In this cultural context, moreover, making distinctions between varieties of non-Jews poses no risk to the overarching rabbinic division of humanity into Jews and idolaters. The Geonim, therefore, continue to employ the Talmudic dichotomy of monotheistic Jews and idolatrous Goyim, even as they distinguish between Gentiles who offer wine libations and Gentiles who don't. They consider it natural to address the fact that Muslims do not offer wine libations, and they implicitly justify their departure from Talmudic conceptions of Gentiles by pointing to the fact that Muslims did not exist before the close of the Talmud. The Geonim imagine, as it were, that Chazal would have also drawn the distinction that the Geonim themselves draw, whereas I'm pointing to the fact that they're doing something quite different. The Rambam, who rejects on principle the notion that Muslims are idolaters, offers a different approach to classifying Gentiles. Instead of employing the binary system used by Chazal and the Geonim, Rambam creates three categories of humanity: Jews, idolaters, and non-Jewish monotheists, namely Muslims. This classificatory system, of course, resembles the tripartite Sunni division of humanity into Muslims, idolaters, and non-Muslim people of the book. Sunnis, however, grant elevated status to non-Muslims on the basis of their receipt of authentic scriptures, and therefore treat Jews and Christians alike. Both the Torah and the Gospels were indeed revealed by God, therefore Jews and Christians are superior to other non-Muslims. It would be anathema to Maimonides' conception of revelation to grant any recognition to the New Testament or the Quran. Instead, the Rambam classifies Gentiles on the basis of their theology, and for that reason distinguishes Muslims from Christians, whose belief in the divinity of Christ contradicts Maimonides' definition of monotheism. The criterion Maimonides uses to classify foreigners, although different from the one used within the classic Sunni system, corresponds with the standard advocated by Muhammad ibn Tumart, founder of the Almohad movement. Zarathustra has identified a number of ways in which Maimonides' works reflect Almohad ideas. It would seem that the Rambam also embraced three Almohad notions about monotheism. 1. Strictly non-anthropomorphic monotheism constitutes a fundamental characteristic in the classification of humanity. 2. Such monotheism is accessible even to those who have not received God's true revelation. One can logically derive that there is only one God. 3. The difference between monotheists and non-monotheists bears legal significance. These ideas were foundational to Almohad policies regarding non-Muslims during Maimonides' formative years. Just as the Geonim take for granted the relevance of information about Islamic ritual practices, the Rambam takes for granted the relevance of information about Islamic theology, and he revises the classical Jewish conception of Gentiles accordingly. In sum, the conceptions of Muslims and Christians found in medieval Halakhic literature from the Islamic world depart in certain respects from Talmudic sources regarding Goyim. These departures reflect patterns of thought that are also attested within Islamic law. It seems reasonable, therefore, to posit that the conceptions of non-Jews held by Geonim and Rishonim who lived in Muslim societies were shaped in part by Islamic thought regarding non-Muslims. This conclusion, however, requires two important caveats. The first is that rabbinic authorities did not absorb Islamic conceptions of foreigners uncritically. Rather, they employed only those elements of Islamic thought that reinforced their own distinctly Jewish worldview. As Ivan Marcus has observed in his study of medieval Ashkenazic Jewry, Jews absorbed into their Judaism aspects of the majority culture and understood the products to be part and parcel of their Judaism. For Maimonides, the Almohad conception of monotheism is not Islamic, but rather is simply true, and thus by definition compatible with Jewish thought. The Sunni practice of granting an elevated legal status to Christians on the basis of their reverence for Scripture, in contrast, makes no sense to Maimonides, and therefore plays no role in his classification of humanity. While Maimonides allows scriptural disputations with Christians rather than Muslims because Christians respect the authority of the Jewish Bible, this in no way implies that Christians bear a different legal status than idolaters. The second caveat regarding rabbinic adaptation of Islamic patterns of thinking about religious foreigners is that such influence is attested in a very small number of Halakhic texts from the Muslim world. Recall that the vast majority of these texts continue to treat Muslims and Christians simply as goyim, in keeping with the binary division between Jews and non-Jews found within Talmudic literature. Even the Rambam, a systematic thinker if there ever was one, refrains from spelling out the logical implications of his assessment of Islamic monotheism. Thus, as Itamar Warhaftig observes, the Rambam declares that one may not heal idolaters, and that one may heal a ger toshav, but he never explains how this law applies to contemporary Muslims. With respect to this and many other laws about goyim, the Rambam contents himself with addressing the categories found within the Talmud himself, even at the cost of leaving halacha l'maaseh ambiguous. Indeed, the only laws in the Mishneh Torah that address Muslims directly, those regarding wine and circumcision, as well as the definition of the kofer, do so when the underlying Talmudic texts provide an opening for such extrapolation. Chazal's practice of treating all goyim alike continues to exert a profound influence even on those medieval authorities who were familiar with alternative approaches to thinking about religious foreigners. The influence of the Talmudic dichotomy that distinguishes Jews from Gentiles without attention to distinctions among non-Jews is even stronger within medieval Ashkenaz. The difference between Ashkenaz and the lands of Islam is evident in the reception by Rashi of a Geonic responsum about wine. Rashi, in the fourth text on your handout, noted that B'tshuvot Geonim matzati, the goyim bizman hazeh einam yodim b'tiv nisuch, she'ein darkam l'shachshech yenam la'avodah zarah, v'yenam mutar v'hana'ah. From the description of this discovery provided elsewhere by Rashbam, it's clear that the responsum to which Rashi refers is the one found in text 3 on your handout, which ascribes to Muslims the status of Tinok ben Yomo. Rashi, however, disregards the fact that this responsum refers specifically to Muslims. Instead, he understands the Geonim to make a general statement about all goyim, none of whom currently perform true acts of wine libation. Whereas the Geonim and the Rambam are careful to limit the applicability of their lenient rulings to wine touched by Muslims, rabbis in Ashkenaz consistently treat all contemporary Gentiles alike. One might account for this difference by pointing to the fact that Ashkenazic rabbis lived in a society that was uniformly Christian. This explanation, however, fails to account for the fact that these authorities willfully overlook the distinctions between Muslims and other Gentiles found within the very Geonic responsa they discuss. Perhaps a better explanation is that rabbis in medieval Ashkenaz were culturally predisposed not to make distinctions among Gentiles. Talmudic literature, after all, lacks such distinctions, and we've seen that many medieval Christian authorities also treat all religious foreigners alike. Only within the Islamic world, in which the dominant culture's legal scholars classify outsiders in multiple categories, do rabbinic authorities even consider departing from Talmudic precedent by establishing legally significant distinctions among Gentiles. Rashi's declaration that no Gentiles currently perform true wine libations may reflect familiarity with an influential responsum by Rabbeinu Gershom or Hagolah, the final text on your handout. This text is one of an extremely small number of Halakhic works from Ashkenaz that address Christianity as such. Yet Rabbeinu Gershom's response has nothing to do with Christianity. He rules in principle that the garments worn by Catholic priests are mishamshei avodah zarah, by analogy to the garments worn by the Kohanim, which are holy. Nevertheless, he declares, Jews may accept priestly garments as collateral for loans, and may engage in commerce with Christians on their holidays. Rabbeinu Gershom offers two reasons for this. Ashkenazic Jews depend on commercial interaction with Gentiles for their livelihood, and out of necessity would violate any prohibition that the rabbis might seek to enforce. Better that we simply keep our mouths shut. In addition to this economic rationale, however, Rabbeinu Gershom appeals to a Talmudic dictum ascribed to Rabbi Yochanan. Goyim shebechutz ha'aretz lav ovdei avodah zarah, ela minhag avoteim bidehem. If Gentiles outside the land of Israel are not truly idolaters, he argues, then onerous Talmudic laws which respond to idolatry need not be enforced in Ashkenaz. Jacob Katz cites this responsum as evidence that Ashkenazic Rishonim exempted Christians from the status of idolaters and ascribed to them a special status. I disagree. Rabbeinu Gershom's ruling applies equally to all Goyim outside the land of Israel, not just Christians. Not only that, it never addresses the distinctive attributes of Christian beliefs or ritual practices. As far as Rabbeinu Gershom is concerned, Christians are simply Goyim, and there's no reason to pay any attention to the substance of Christianity. The same may be said regarding Rashi and other medieval Ashkenazic authorities. For example, in the hundreds of responsa by Meir of Rothenburg that I've examined, I have yet to find a single responsum that addresses Christianity itself, or that distinguishes Christians from other Goyim. Yehuda Galinsky's recent study of 12th and 13th century rabbinic attitudes regarding the Christian cult of the saints is striking for its complete lack of references to legal texts that address this subject. I draw attention to this absence because it accurately reflects the nature of the primary sources with which Professor Galinsky is working. Ashkenazic rabbis frequently address claims of miraculous healing associated with saints' relics within the context of anti-Christian polemics. In their legal literature, however, these authorities see no need to address an important aspect of contemporary Christian life. Indeed, Moshe of Kusi refers to the cult of the saints in his polemical introduction to Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, but not in the legally oriented body of the text, which to the best of my knowledge contains no references to Christian beliefs or practices. The only halachic text that Galinsky could find related to his subject matter is a passage from Sefer HaTrumah by the Tosfos Baruch Bar Yitzchak on receiving medical treatment from Goyim. One may not accept treatment from akum or minim, synonyms in medieval rabbinic parlance, when those doctors invoke idolatry as part of their healing practices or prescribe medicines linked to idolatrous shrines. Baruch Bar Yitzchak makes no reference to Christians in this passage, and his ruling, which applies in principle to Christians and non-Christians alike, conforms entirely to Talmudic literature with respect to its terminology and its halachic bottom line. Professor Lasker has observed that Rashi's exegetical works display limited engagement with Christian thought, and indeed limited knowledge of Christianity. He draws from this the more general conclusion that Jews in 11th and 12th century Ashkenaz did not know much about Christianity. This argument is certainly plausible in light of Rashi's legal writings as well, but I would be skeptical about drawing a similar conclusion regarding 13th century Jews from the limited engagement with Christianity manifest in halachic works such as the Responsa of Meir of Rothenburg. We know, for example, that Moshe of Kusi knew far more about Christianity than he chose to address in the body of Sefer Mitzvot Gadol. Instead, I would suggest that rabbis in medieval Ashkenaz saw no reason to engage distinctly Christian beliefs or practices in their halachic works, whatever their knowledge about Christianity may have been. This may simply reflect the Talmudic pattern of lumping all Gentiles into a single category. Ironically, it may also constitute a Jewish response to contemporaneous Christian conceptions of foreigners. Recall that two paradigms competed for prominence within medieval canon law. The newer paradigm, which assigns the same legal status to all non-Christians, parallels the Talmudic practice of treating all Gentiles alike. There is no way, therefore, to know for certain whether Rishonim from Ashkenaz were familiar with this Christian paradigm. Whether they treated all Gentiles alike because that's what Chazal did, or they treated all Gentiles alike because that's what the Christians do, they'd be doing exactly the same thing. The classic Christian paradigm, in contrast, defines Jews as uniquely significant and distinctly problematic. If Rishonim had embraced this paradigm, which they did not, they would have singled out Christianity for condemnation within their halachic works. Daniel Boyarin has argued that Chazal abstained from, and in fact consciously rejected, the Christian practice of defining Judaism as one religion among several. This definition served the interests of imperially sponsored Christian orthodoxy, but did not bolster Jewish identity as Chazal conceived it. So Chazal persisted in employing the binary and quasi-ethnic division between Jews and everyone else. It would make perfect sense for halachic authorities in Ashkenaz to similarly reject the Christian practice of ascribing significance to the beliefs and practices of religious foreigners. This practice serves to reinforce identity when defined in Christian terms, but it in no way bolsters the kind of Jewish identity which Ashkenazic Rishonim inherited from Chazal. Chazal and Ashkenazic Rishonim alike embraced the dictum, Umi k'amcha Yisrael, goy echad ba'aretz. No other goyim merit attention, and to single out Christians as distinctive would in fact undermine the distinctiveness of Judaism itself. In a sense, then, Professor Lasker's question regarding how much the rabbis of 12th and 13th century Ashkenaz knew about Christianity is an inappropriate one when applied to halachic literature. For the same reason, I pose the wrong question when I seek to assess the conceptions of Christianity found in this literature. As halachists, Ashkenazic Rishonim had no interest in expressing either their knowledge of Christianity or their ideas about Christianity. These interests only find expression in Ashkenaz within polemical literature, a genre not directly beholden to Talmudic worldviews or precedents. One can, in contrast, assess the conceptions of Christianity and Islam found in halachic literature from the Islamic world. This includes not only works of the Rambam, but also those of the Geonim, and quite probably others which I have yet to study as well. I've suggested this afternoon that the influence of Islamic culture accounts for the limited degree to which these medieval authorities depart from Talmudic precedent when addressing non-Jews. The lack of evidence for the influence of Christian culture on Ashkenazic conceptions of Goyim, in contrast, does not necessarily indicate that Rishonim in Europe were unaffected by their surroundings in this regard. Perhaps they were familiar with Christian conceptions of non-Christians. Perhaps they weren't. Perhaps they were generally knowledgeable about Christianity. Perhaps they weren't. Ashkenazic legal literature, it turns out, is a singularly poor vehicle for clarifying these issues, precisely because of its fidelity to Talmudic precedents. Simcha Emanuel captures this dynamic when he writes regarding Ashkenazic laws governing Gentile wet nurses, Kedarka shel halacha, chashasham shel Tanaim v'hamoraim, hu shekava et darkam shel poskim b'yemei benaim. וכמעט איש מהם לא העלה על דעתו לשנות את הפסיקה בהלכה זו על פי המציאות בימיו. The realistic depiction of foreigners, after all, was never a goal of the halakha, nor for that matter of its Christian and Islamic counterparts. Rather, I would suggest that the primary purpose of laws regarding Goyim was to bolster rabbinic conceptions of Jewish identity. The evolution of these laws and their portrayals of non-Jews, therefore, offers valuable insights into developments in Jewish self-conceptions.
תודה רבה על ההרצאה המרתקת.